A killer stalked the streets of a major American city for over a year. This killer broke into homes in the dead of night, attacked sleeping victims with an axe, and left behind scenes of horrific violence. But what made this case truly bizarre was that the killer wrote letters to the newspapers, taunting the police, claiming to be a demon from hell, and even demanding that the entire city played jazz music to avoid being murdered. The police investigated dozens of attacks. They had clues, they had witnesses, they had the killer's own words, and yet they never made an arrest. The axeman killed, terrorized, wrote, and vanished. Over a century later, we still do not know who he was or why he stopped. Justice never came. Imagine living in a city where every night you go to sleep, you wonder if tonight is the night a killer breaks into your home, where reading the morning newspaper means learning about another brutal attack, another family shattered, another set of victims who thought they were safe behind locked doors. Today, we're diving into one of the most terrifying and bizarre serial killer cases in American history, the Axeman of New Orleans, who terrorized Louisiana from 1918 to 1919. This is the story of a killer who seemed to appear from nowhere, strike without pattern or reason, and disappear like smoke. A killer who wrote letters claiming supernatural origins and made an entire city dance to jazz music out of fear. This case will show you how terror can grip a population, how a serial killer can operate with impunity, and how sometimes the most publicized cases remain the most mysterious. To understand this case and why it remains unsolved, we need to go back to New Orleans in 1918. This was a city unlike any other in America, a place where cultures mixed, where jazz was being born in the streets, where the line between the sacred and profane was always blurred. But it was also a city under siege, not from the Axeman yet, but from World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic that was beginning to sweep the globe. New Orleans in 1918 was a city of immigrants, particularly Italian immigrants who had settled in large numbers and formed tight-knit communities. These Italian families ran grocery stores, worked as laborers, and struggled to build lives in America while facing discrimination and suspicion. The police force was underfunded, understaffed, and in some cases, corrupt. Solving crimes depended heavily on witness cooperation. But in immigrant communities where trust in authorities was low, getting people to talk was difficult. The city had no centralized forensic laboratory, no criminal profiling, no way to track patterns across multiple crimes except through manual record keeping. When a serial killer emerged, the police were ill-equipped to catch someone who struck randomly, left few clues, and seemed to have no clear motive. This was the environment into which the Axeman would emerge, a perfect storm of chaos, fear, and institutional inability to respond effectively. The first known attack occurred on May 23, 1918, though there may have been earlier victims that were not connected to the series. Joseph Maggio was an Italian immigrant who ran a small grocery store with his wife Catherine. They lived in an apartment behind their store in a working-class neighborhood. In the early morning hours, someone used a chisel to remove a panel from their back door, gaining entry to their home. While they slept, the intruder found an axe on the property, possibly from their own woodshed, and attacked them in their bed. Joseph's throat was cut, and he was struck with the axe. Catherine suffered similar injuries. Both died from their wounds. Joseph's brothers, who lived nearby, discovered the bodies the next morning. The scene was brutal, blood everywhere, signs of a violent struggle, but there was no apparent motive. Nothing of significant value was stolen. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was murder for its own sake. The police found a cryptic message written in chalk near the scene, though its meaning was unclear and its connection to the killer disputed. The investigation went nowhere. Just weeks later, on June 28th, another attack. Louis Besumer, a grocer, and his partner Harriet Lowe were attacked in their home, again through a chiseled door panel, again with an axe found on the property. Both survived, but were severely injured. Harriet later died from her wounds, and before dying, she made confused statements about who had attacked them, further muddying the investigation. On August 5th, Mrs. Edward Schneider, who was pregnant, was attacked in her home while her husband was at work. She survived, though barely, and later gave birth to a healthy child. Despite her injuries, she could provide almost no information about her attacker, having been asleep when struck. The attacks continued through the summer and fall of 1918, each following a similar pattern. Italian grocers or their families, late night or early morning attacks, entry through chiseled door panels, the killer using an axe found at the scene rather than bringing a weapon. Victims struck while sleeping. Sometimes they died. Sometimes they survived with terrible injuries. The randomness was part of what made it so terrifying. There was no way to predict who would be next. By the end of 1918, New Orleans was gripped by panic. People barricaded their doors. Families slept in shifts, one person always awake to stand guard. Gun sales soared. The Italian community in particular lived in constant fear, wondering if they were being specifically targeted. Before we continue with what happened next, I need to pause here for a moment, because I know what you might be feeling right now when you hear about a killer breaking into homes, attacking people in their sleep, in the place where they should be safest. It touches something primal, the fear of not being safe in your own bed, of being vulnerable when you're unconscious. It's one of the deepest fears humans have, and this wasn't just one attack. This was months of terror. An entire city held hostage by someone who could strike anywhere, anytime. I want to ask you something. Have you ever felt truly unsafe in your own home? That creeping dread that someone might be outside watching, waiting. That's what the people of New Orleans lived with every single day. If this case is making you think about how fragile our sense of security really is, just type in the comments, "Fear is real." Those 3 words, because acknowledging that fear is the first step to understanding how this killer controlled an entire city. Your comments matter. They show that these historical terrors still resonate. Thank you for being here. Now, let's continue with the most bizarre twist in this case. On March 13th, 1919, something unprecedented happened. The Times-Picayune newspaper received a letter. It was supposedly from the killer himself, and it was unlike any serial killer communication authorities had seen before. The letter began with the now famous words, "Hell, March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans." The writer claimed to be a demon, a supernatural entity that had existed for ages, who could take any form and pass through the city unseen. The letter was theatrical, grandiose, and deeply unsettling. But what made it truly bizarre was the demand the writer made. He stated that on the night of March 19th, he would descend upon New Orleans again, but he would spare any home where jazz music was being played. If a house was silent, the occupants would be at risk. If jazz was playing, the axeman promised to pass by. The letter ended with a taunt. "Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am, but I could be much worse if I wanted to. I shall be most merciful. At exactly 12:15 on the night of March 19th, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I am going to make a little proposition to you people. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 on the night of March 19th, I am going to pass over New Orleans. In your homes, you will place phonographs or jazz bands to play jazz music. Those homes without jazz music will be the ones I visit. The letter caused a sensation. Some believed it was genuine, written by the killer. Others thought it was a hoax, someone taking advantage of the fear to play a cruel prank. The newspaper published it in full, and the city erupted in debate. Should people take this seriously? Was the killer really giving them away to protect themselves? Or was this psychological torture? On the night of March 19th, 1919, New Orleans became the loudest city in America. Nearly every home, every bar, every dance hall played jazz music as loud as possible. The streets echoed with sound. People who normally never listened to jazz played it that night. Parties erupted across the city, driven not by celebration, but by terror. If playing music might save your life, you played music. Remarkably, no attacks occurred that night. Whether the letter was genuine and the killer kept his word, or whether it was a hoax and the timing was coincidental, no one knows. But the city breathed a sigh of relief, and jazz musicians suddenly found themselves in bizarre demand as protection against a supernatural serial killer. The attacks did continue after that night, however. On August 10th, 1919, Sarah Laumann was attacked and survived. On September 3rd, a man named Mike Pepitone was killed in his home. His wife and children in adjacent rooms, hearing the attack but unable to stop it. Mike's wife saw the killer fleeing, described him as a large man in dark clothing, but could provide no identifying features. After the Pepitone murder, the attacks stopped. The axeman, whoever he was, vanished as suddenly as he had appeared. Thanks for sticking with this bizarre case. If you want more stories about history's strangest mysteries, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, here's where the investigation completely fell apart. The police investigation into the Axeman murders was plagued by problems from the beginning. Different detectives worked different cases without coordination. Witness statements were unreliable, as many victims had been attacked while asleep and never saw their assailant. The immigrant community, already distrustful of police, was reluctant to share information. Some victims initially survived and gave statements, but their accounts were often confused or contradictory, perhaps due to trauma or head injuries. The police pursued various theories. Some investigators believed the killer was specifically targeting Italian grocers, perhaps because of some grudge or vendetta. Others thought the Italian connection was coincidental, and the killer simply chose victims of opportunity in working-class neighborhoods. There was speculation about mafia involvement, that the attacks were executions disguised as the work of a random maniac. But the mafia theory never held up, as the victims were not the kind of people typically involved in organized crime. They were ordinary shopkeepers and their families. Several suspects were arrested over the course of the investigation, but none were ever charged. The evidence was always too thin, the connections too speculative. One suspect was a man seen near one of the crime scenes. Another was someone who had made threatening statements. Yet another was a mentally ill individual who confessed, but his confession did not match the facts of the crimes. The police were grasping at straws, desperate to calm public panic, but unable to build a case that would stand up in court. The letter complicated everything. If it was genuine, it suggested a killer with theatrical tendencies, someone who enjoyed the attention and wanted to toy with authorities. If it was a hoax, it meant someone else was exploiting the terror for unknown reasons. The police could never determine the letter's authenticity with certainty. Handwriting analysis was primitive in 1919, and without a suspect to compare the writing to, it provided no leads. One strange footnote to the case involves Mike Pepitone's widow. Several months after her husband's murder, a woman matching her description shot and killed a man named Joseph Mumfre in Los Angeles. She claimed Mumfre was the axeman, that he had killed her husband, and she had tracked him across the country to exact revenge. Mumfre was a criminal with a record of violent crimes, and some investigators noted that his periods of incarceration coincided with gaps in the axeman attacks. Could he have been the killer? The widow certainly believed so, but the evidence connecting Mumfre to the New Orleans murders was entirely circumstantial. He was never proven to be the axeman, and the widow's actions raised as many questions as they answered. Was this justice or simply murder motivated by grief and rage? So who was the axeman of New Orleans, and why did the attack stop in late 1919? More than a century later, we have theories, but no definitive answers. The most persistent theory is that the killer was Joseph Mumfre, the man shot by Mike Pepitone's widow. According to this theory, Mumfre was a violent criminal who for unknown reasons began breaking into homes and attacking people with axes. Perhaps he was mentally disturbed, driven by compulsions he could not control. Perhaps the Italian grocers represented something to him, a symbol of his own failures or resentments. When Mumfre was killed in Los Angeles in 1919, the attack stopped, which supporters of this theory point to as proof. But there are problems with the Mumfre theory. There is no physical evidence placing him at any of the crime scenes. No witnesses identified him. The connection rests entirely on timing and the word of a grieving widow who may have simply wanted someone to blame. It is possible Mumfre was the axeman, but it is equally possible he was just another violent criminal who became a convenient scapegoat. Another theory suggests the axeman was never one person, but rather multiple killers whose crimes were lumped together because of superficial similarities. According to this view, some of the attacks were the work of a serial killer, while others were robberies or personal vendettas that happened to involve axes and Italian victims. The copycat theory would explain why the attacks seemed to vary in execution and why they eventually stopped without anyone being caught. But this theory requires accepting that multiple different attackers all chose similar methods in the same city within a short time frame, which seems unlikely. Then there is the theory that the axeman was someone within the Italian community itself, perhaps someone with a personal vendetta against multiple families. This would explain why the killer seemed to know which homes to target, why he attacked at times when victims would be most vulnerable, and why the immigrant community was reluctant to cooperate with police. If the killer was one of their own, protecting him or investigating him independently might have seemed preferable to involving corrupt police who had a history of discriminating against Italian immigrants. But no evidence of such a vendetta was ever discovered, and most of the victims seemed to have no connections to each other beyond being Italian grocers. Some researchers have suggested the killer may have died or been imprisoned for other crimes, which would explain why the attack stopped suddenly. Perhaps he was killed in the war, or died in the flu pandemic, or was locked up for an unrelated offense. Without his identity, we will never know. The letter remains one of the most puzzling aspects. If genuine, it suggests a killer with a theatrical personality, someone who enjoyed the publicity and wanted to be part of the narrative. The demand for jazz music could have been a taunt, a way of making the entire city dance to his tune, literally. Or it could have had personal significance. Perhaps the killer was a jazz musician himself, or someone deeply connected to that culture. If the letter was a hoax, then we have two mysteries. instead of one? Who was the killer and who wrote the letter? The truth is that we will probably never know who the Axeman was. Too much time has passed. Everyone involved is dead. The physical evidence that existed has been lost. The case files are incomplete. What we are left with is a legend, a story of terror that gripped New Orleans for over a year and then vanished into history. More than 100 years have passed since the Axeman last struck. The investigation, despite massive public attention and pressure, never produced an arrest. The killer, whoever he was, got away with it. He murdered, he terrorized, he wrote letters claiming to be a demon, and then he disappeared. The victims of the Axeman attacks are buried in New Orleans cemeteries, their graves marked with simple stones that give no indication of the horror they endured. Joseph and Catherine Maggio, who ran a small grocery and were killed in their own bed. Mike Pepitone, who died while his family listened helplessly from the next room. The survivors who lived with physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. None of them received justice. None of their families received closure. The truth died with the killer. If indeed there was only one killer, New Orleans moved on, as cities do. The Axeman became a legend, a ghost story, a piece of local folklore, but the fear he created was real. The lives he destroyed were real, and the failure of authorities to stop him or identify him remains a stain on the history of American law enforcement. Some killers are never caught, not because investigators don't try, but because sometimes evidence isn't enough, witnesses don't exist, and luck favors the wicked. This is one of those cases. Thank you for listening to this strange and disturbing story. If you have theories about who the Axeman really was, if you believe the letter was genuine or a hoax, or if this case has affected you, share your thoughts in the comments below. These victims deserve to be remembered as more than just entries in a list of unsolved murders. Until next time, take care, and I'll see you in the next case.